Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something a little different. Pirates, treasure, and the surprisingly mundane reality of how these seafaring rogues actually found their loot without the romantic treasure maps we see in movies. So dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's float back to the golden age of piracy, somewhere between the late 1600s and early 1700s, when the Caribbean was crawling with desperate men, leaky ships, and far less buried treasure than you'd think. The truth is, pirates didn't wander around with rolled-up parchments marked with big red X's, because most of them couldn't read, let alone draw a map, and the treasure they were after wasn't sitting in a chest on some deserted island. It was moving, on ships, in courts, and sometimes right under the noses of European empires who were too busy fighting each other to notice a few scruffy guys with cutlasses helping themselves to the goods. Let's start with the basics. What even was pirate treasure? Well, forget the image of gold doubloons spilling out of wooden chests. Sure, pirates loved gold and silver, but the real treasure was whatever they could steal and sell quickly. Sugar, tobacco, spices, rum, textiles, tools, weapons, medicine, and sometimes human cargo in the form of enslaved people, which is a dark and uncomfortable truth about piracy that often gets glossed over in the romanticized versions. Pirates were opportunists, and their treasure was defined by what was valuable at the time and what they could offload without getting hanged. So how did they find it? The answer is surprisingly straightforward: intelligence networks, observation, timing, and a whole lot of hanging around in the right places at the right times. Pirates didn't hunt treasure, they hunted ships, and those ships were predictable. See, the colonial powers of the 17th and 18th centuries, Spain, England, France, the Dutch, were running massive trade networks across the Atlantic and Caribbean. Ships loaded with goods from the Americas would sail back to Europe along well-established routes, and pirates knew these routes like the back of their weathered, sunburned hands. The Spanish treasure fleets, for example, sailed from Havana to Spain twice a year, loaded with silver from the mines of Potosi in present-day Bolivia and gold from Mexico. These fleets followed predictable paths through the Florida Straits and then across the Atlantic, and pirates would lurk near choke points, narrow channels, island clusters, or busy ports, waiting for stragglers or ships that got separated from the convoy. It wasn't about maps. It was about knowing where the money was moving and being patient enough to intercept it. Pirates also gathered intelligence from taverns, brothels, and dockside gossip. Port towns like Port Royal in Jamaica, Nassau in the Bahamas, and Tortuga off the coast of Haiti were pirate havens where information flowed as freely as the rum. Sailors, merchants, and even corrupt officials would talk, and pirates would listen. They'd learn which ships were leaving port, what they were carrying, when they were expected to arrive, and whether they were well-armed or vulnerable. This kind of intelligence was worth more than any treasure map, because it told pirates exactly where to be and when. Some pirates even had informants, people on the inside who would tip them off for exchange for a cut of the loot. It was a dirty, decentralized economy of crime, and it worked remarkably well until the colonial powers started cracking down with naval patrols and public hangings.
Now let's talk about the myth of the treasure map itself, because it's one of the most enduring images in pirate lore, and it's almost entirely fiction. The idea of a pirate drawing a map, marking an X, and burying treasure for later retrieval sounds great in a novel, but in practice it made no sense. Pirates lived short, violent lives. The average pirate's career lasted only a few years before they were killed, captured, or died of disease. They didn't bury treasure because they didn't trust each other enough to leave it unguarded, and they didn't expect to live long enough to come back for it. When pirates captured loot, they divided it up immediately according to the ship's articles, a set of rules that governed everything from how much the captain got to how much a carpenter or musician received. Everyone took their share and spent it as fast as possible, usually on booze, gambling, and women, because tomorrow they might be dead. The whole concept of buried treasure comes largely from one book, Treasure Island by Robert Louis Stevenson, published in 1883, which popularized the image of a peg-legged pirate, a parrot, and a treasure map. Before that, buried treasure wasn't a major part of pirate mythology. There is one famous real-life case of a pirate allegedly burying treasure, Captain William Kidd, who was hanged in 1701. Kidd claimed he buried treasure on Gardiner's Island off the coast of New York, and some of it was actually recovered and used as evidence against him at his trial. But this was an exception, not the rule. And Kidd wasn't even really a pirate. He was a privateer who got caught up in political intrigue and accusations of piracy. The treasure he buried wasn't some grand stash. It was a desperate attempt to have something to bargain with if he got arrested, which he did, and it didn't help him. So if pirates didn't use maps, how did they navigate and find their targets? Well, navigation in the age of sail was a mix of art, science, and guesswork. Pirates used the same tools as everyone else: compasses, the sun, the stars, and dead reckoning, which is a method of estimating your position based on speed, time, and direction from a known point. They didn't need precise charts for every island. They just needed to know the general layout of the Caribbean, where the major ports were, and where ships were likely to pass through. Many pirates were former sailors who had worked on merchant or naval vessels, so they already knew the trade routes and the geography. They also relied on local knowledge, captured sailors, indigenous guides, or even enslaved people who knew the coastlines and hidden coves where a ship could lie in wait. Pirates would anchor in secluded bays, send out small boats to scout for passing ships, and then strike when the moment was right. It was ambush tactics, not treasure hunts.
Let's take a closer look at some of the most successful pirates and how they operated, because their methods reveal just how practical and unglamorous piracy really was. Blackbeard, whose real name was Edward Teach, is probably the most famous pirate in history, and he didn't need a treasure map. He had a fleet, a fearsome reputation, and a gift for psychological warfare. Blackbeard operated in the waters off the Carolinas and the Caribbean in the early 1700s, and his strategy was to terrify his victims into surrendering without a fight. He would weave slow-burning fuses into his beard and light them during battle, so that smoke wreathed his face, making him look like a demon from hell. He'd fly black flags, fire warning shots, and generally project an image of violence and chaos, even though he reportedly killed very few people. Most ships just gave up when they saw him coming. Blackbeard's treasure came from blockading the port of Charleston, South Carolina in 1718, where he held the entire city hostage and demanded a chest of medicine in exchange for releasing his prisoners. He got his medicine, which was worth a lot more than gold in an era when disease killed more sailors than combat, and he sailed away. Blackbeard didn't bury treasure, he spent it. And when he was killed in a battle with the Royal Navy later that year, there was no stash to be found. His treasure was his reputation, and it died with him. Then there's Henry Morgan, a Welsh privateer who became one of the richest and most successful pirates or privateers, depending on how you define it, of the 17th century. Morgan operated with the unofficial blessing of the English government, raiding Spanish colonies and ships in the Caribbean. His most famous exploit was the sack of Panama City in 1671, where he led a force of over 1,000 men across the Isthmus of Panama, captured the city, and made off with a fortune in gold, silver, and goods. Morgan didn't need a map to find Panama. He knew it was there because it was a major Spanish stronghold, and he used intelligence from captured prisoners and local guides to plan his attack. After the raid, Morgan returned to Jamaica a hero, was knighted by King Charles II, and became the lieutenant governor of Jamaica, which is one of the wildest career pivots in history, from pirate to politician, because of course he did. Morgan's treasure wasn't buried, It was invested, spent, and legitimized, and he lived out his days as a wealthy, respectable landowner. Another fascinating case is that of Bartholomew Roberts, also known as Black Bart, who is considered one of the most successful pirates in terms of sheer numbers. He captured over 400 ships during his career, which is an absurd total. Roberts didn't use treasure maps. He used speed, discipline, and a well-organized crew. He had a strict code of conduct on his ship, including no gambling, no drinking to excess, and lights out by 8 p.m., which sounds more like a summer camp than a pirate ship, but it worked. Roberts operated off the coasts of West Africa and the Caribbean, targeting slave ships, merchant vessels, and even Portuguese treasure fleets. His strategy was to strike fast, take what he needed, and move on before naval patrols could catch up. Roberts was killed in a naval battle off the coast of Gabon in 1722, and when his crew was captured, they testified that there was no buried treasure. Everything had been divided and spent. The idea that pirates buried treasure also ignores the logistical nightmare of actually digging a hole big enough to hide a significant amount of loot. Gold and silver are heavy, really heavy. A single Spanish doubloon weighed about 7 grams, so a chest full of them would weigh hundreds of pounds. Digging a hole in sand or rocky soil with 17th century tools in tropical heat while worried about being discovered or attacked wasn't something pirates wanted to do if they could avoid it. And even if they did bury something, how would they remember where it was? The landscape shifts, storms, erosion, vegetation growth, and without precise surveying tools, it would be nearly impossible to relocate a buried stash years later. Pirates weren't stupid. They knew this, which is why they didn't bother.
Now, let's talk about the role of pirate havens, because these places were crucial to how pirates operated and found their targets. Nassau, in the Bahamas, was the pirate capital of the world for a brief period in the early 1700s. It had a natural harbor, no effective government, and a population of pirates, smugglers, and hangers-on who created a kind of anarchic floating economy. Pirates would bring their loot to Nassau, sell it to merchants and fences, resupply their ships, and gather information about upcoming targets. The governor of the Bahamas at the time was either too weak or too corrupt to stop them, and Nassau became a clearinghouse for stolen goods. It wasn't until the British sent Woodes Rogers, a former privateer himself, to restore order in 1718 that Nassau was cleaned up. Rogers offered a pardon to pirates who gave up their trade, and many took it, including Benjamin Hornigold, who became a pirate hunter working for the British. The ones who didn't accept the pardon, like Charles Vane and Calico Jack Rackham, were hunted down and hanged. The point is, pirates didn't need maps because they had networks, places where they could gather, trade, and plan their next moves. Another important aspect of pirate treasure hunting was the practice of careening, which is when a ship is beached and tilted on its side so the hull can be cleaned of barnacles and repaired. This was necessary maintenance in an era before dry docks, and pirates would often careen their ships in hidden coves or remote islands. These locations became known to pirate crews and were passed along by word of mouth, not by maps. A good careening spot was worth its weight in gold because it allowed pirates to keep their ships fast and seaworthy, which was essential for outrunning naval patrols. Some of these spots, like the island of Tortuga, became legendary in pirate lore, not because treasure was buried there, but because they were safe havens where pirates could refit and regroup. Let's also address the role of privateers, because the line between pirate and privateer was often blurry, and privateers operated with a level of legitimacy that pure pirates didn't have. A privateer was essentially a government-sanctioned pirate, someone who had a letter of marque from a king or queen giving them permission to attack enemy ships during wartime. The idea was that privateers would weaken the enemy's economy and navy without the government having to spend money on a large fleet. Privateers like Henry Morgan, Francis Drake, and Jean Lafitte operated in this gray area, and their treasure hunting methods were identical to pirates. They knew the trade routes, they gathered intelligence, and they struck when the opportunity arose. The difference was that privateers could sell their loot legally in their home ports and didn't have to worry about being hanged, at least not immediately. Of course, many privateers turned to outright piracy when the wars ended and their letters of marque were revoked, because old habits die hard and the Caribbean was still full of slow, undefended merchant ships.
Now, let's talk about the Spanish treasure fleets in more detail, because they were the ultimate pirate target, and understanding how they worked explains a lot about pirate tactics. Spain controlled vast territories in the Americas, and every year they would send fleets of ships, called the flota system, to collect the wealth of the New World and bring it back to Spain. These fleets would gather at Havana, Cuba, and then sail together for protection, because a convoy of dozens of ships with armed escorts was much harder to attack than a single vessel. But the system had weaknesses. Ships would sometimes get separated from the fleet due to storms or navigational errors, and those stragglers were easy prey for pirates. Pirates would lurk near the Florida Straits, where the Gulf Stream current made it the fastest route back to Europe, and wait for ships that had fallen behind. They didn't need a map. They just needed patience and a fast ship. There's also the famous case of the 1715 Spanish treasure fleet, which was caught in a hurricane off the coast of Florida and wrecked, scattering millions of dollars worth of silver and gold across the ocean floor. Pirates and salvagers immediately descended on the site, and treasure hunters are still finding coins and artifacts from that wreck today, over 300 years later. This wasn't a case of buried treasure. It was a natural disaster that created an underwater treasure trove, and people have been looking for it ever since. Another factor in how pirates found treasure was sheer luck. The ocean in the 17th and 18th centuries was a crowded, chaotic place, full of ships moving between Europe, Africa, and the Americas in a massive triangular trade network. Pirates didn't have to search hard for targets, they just had to be in the right place, and sooner or later, a merchant ship would come along. Some pirates would even disguise their ships as harmless traders, flying false flags and approaching unsuspecting vessels before revealing their true nature and demanding surrender. This tactic, called flying false colors, was common and effective, and it didn't require any maps or insider knowledge, just a bit of deception and timing. Let's talk about some of the myths versus realities of pirate treasure. The myth says that pirates buried chests of gold on remote islands and drew elaborate maps with cryptic clues. The reality is that pirates took whatever they could get, cash, goods, supplies, and divided it up immediately because they didn't trust each other and didn't expect to live long. The myth says that pirate captains were all-powerful tyrants who ruled their crews with an iron fist. The reality is that pirate ships were surprisingly democratic. Captains were elected by the crew and could be voted out if they were incompetent or too cruel. The Articles of Agreement on pirate ships laid out rules for everything from the division of loot to compensation for injuries, and these rules were taken seriously. A pirate who lost a leg in battle might receive 600 pieces of 8 as compensation, while a lost eye was worth 100. This wasn't a lawless free-for-all, it was a rough form of social contract, and it worked because everyone had skin in the game. The myth says that pirates spent all their time fighting epic sea battles. The reality is that most pirates avoided fights whenever possible because battles were costly in terms of lives, ammunition, and damage to the ship. It was far better to intimidate a target into surrendering, which is why pirates cultivated terrifying reputations and flew scary flags. The Jolly Roger, the black flag with a skull and crossbones, wasn't just for show, it was a psychological weapon that said, "Surrender now or we'll kill you all." Most merchant ships, which were lightly armed and crewed by sailors who had no interest in dying for someone else's cargo, would give up without a fight. Now let's talk about some specific techniques pirates used to gather intelligence and find targets. One common method was to capture a ship and interrogate the crew and passengers.
Pirates would demand to know where the ship had been, where it was going, what it was carrying, and whether there were any other valuable ships nearby. They might torture uncooperative prisoners or threaten them with death, but often just the threat was enough to get people talking. Once they had this information, pirates could adjust their course and head toward richer targets. They also paid attention to shipping schedules and seasonal patterns. Certain goods, like sugar or tobacco, were harvested at specific times of year, and pirates knew when the ships loaded with those goods would be sailing. Another technique was to use lookout posts on high points of islands or coastlines. A pirate crew might station a few men on a hill with a spyglass to watch for passing ships, and when they spotted a promising target, they'd signal to the main crew waiting below. This kind of surveillance required local knowledge and a good understanding of ship movements, but it didn't require maps, just eyes and patience. Pirates also relied on the grapevine of the maritime world. Sailors talked, and word would spread about which ships were loaded with treasure, which captains were cowards, and which routes were being patrolled by naval vessels. A pirate with good connections could learn more from a few hours in a tavern than from a dozen maps.
Let's also consider the role of former sailors and naval deserters in pirate crews. Many pirates had previously served on merchant ships or in the Navy, where they learned navigation, seamanship, and the workings of maritime trade. When they turned to piracy, they brought that knowledge with them. They didn't need maps because they already knew the Caribbean like the back of their hand. They'd sailed those waters dozens of times under legitimate captains, and they knew where the money was moving. This inside knowledge was invaluable. And it's one reason why piracy flourished in the early 18th century. There were a lot of experienced, disgruntled sailors looking for a better payday, and piracy offered it, at least in the short term. Now, let's talk about the decline of piracy and how it relates to treasure. By the 1720s, European powers had had enough of pirates disrupting trade and costing them money. The British Royal Navy stepped up patrols, colonial governors offered pardons to pirates who gave up their trade, and those who refused were hunted down and hanged in public spectacles meant to discourage others. The golden age of piracy was over, and with it went any hope of finding those mythical buried treasures. The pirates who survived either retired quietly with their loot, accepted pardons and went straight, or were captured and executed. There was no grand treasure left behind because there never had been. The treasure was always in motion, being stolen, spent, and divided up, and the idea of a hidden stash was mostly a fantasy. That said, there are a few documented cases of buried or hidden treasure, though they're rare and usually involve special circumstances. We already mentioned Captain Kidd, who buried some treasure on Gardiner's Island, but that was recovered. There's also the case of the pirate ship Whydah, which sank off the coast of Cape Cod in 1717 during a storm. The wreck was discovered in 1984, and divers have recovered over 200,000 artifacts, including gold, silver, and coins, making it the first authenticated pirate shipwreck ever found. But this wasn't buried treasure, it was a sunken ship, and the treasure was there because the ship went down, not because anyone hid it. The discovery of the Whydah has provided historians with incredible insights into pirate life, from the weapons they used to the goods they stole, and it's a reminder that real pirate treasure is usually found underwater, not underground. Another interesting case is the legend of the Treasure of Lima, which supposedly involves a massive haul of gold, silver, and jewels that was being evacuated from Lima, Peru in 1820 during the Wars of Independence. The story goes that the treasure was loaded onto a ship captained by a British sailor named William Thompson, who decided to turn pirate, murdered the crew guarding the treasure, and buried it on Cocos Island off the coast of Costa Rica. Thompson was captured and hanged without revealing the location, and treasure hunters have been searching Cocos Island ever since, though no one has found anything conclusive. The problem with legends like this is that they're often based on a kernel of truth that's been exaggerated and embellished over centuries. Maybe there was a treasure, maybe there wasn't, but the fact that no one has found it despite extensive searches suggests that if it ever existed, it's long gone.
Let's also talk about the economics of piracy, because understanding how pirates made money helps explain why they didn't bury treasure. Pirates operated in a cash-based economy, where the goal was to capture goods, sell them as quickly as possible, and spend the proceeds before you died. A successful pirate raid might net a crew thousands of pieces of eight, which would be divided up according to the ship's articles. The captain might get 2 or 3 shares, the quartermaster and other officers would get 1.5 or 2 shares, and ordinary crew members would get 1 share each. Wounded pirates got extra compensation, and certain roles, like the carpenter or surgeon, might get a little more because their skills were valuable. Once the loot was divided, everyone would head to port and blow their money on whatever they wanted: rum, women, gambling, new clothes, or supplies for the next voyage. There was no concept of saving or investing, because pirates lived in the moment, knowing that their careers were likely to be short and violent. This lifestyle didn't lend itself to burying treasure for later. It was all about the here and now. Now, let's consider the role of geography in pirate operations. The Caribbean was ideal for piracy because it was a maze of islands, cays, and hidden harbors where a ship could disappear and evade pursuit. Pirates knew the local geography intimately. They knew which channels were too shallow for large naval vessels, which islands had fresh water and food, and where they could hide and ambush passing ships. This knowledge was passed down orally and through experience, not through maps. A good pirate captain would have a mental map of the Caribbean, built up over years of sailing, raiding, and surviving. They'd know that a certain island had a good careening beach on the north side, or that a particular channel was tricky to navigate but offered a shortcut, or that a certain port was friendly to pirates and asked no questions. This kind of local knowledge was the real treasure because it kept you alive and helped you find your next target. Let's talk about some of the tools and methods pirates used for navigation, because even though they didn't have treasure maps, they still needed to know where they were going. The compass was the most basic tool, and it had been in use for centuries by the time of the golden age of piracy. A compass could tell you which direction you were heading, but it couldn't tell you your exact position, so pirates also used dead reckoning, which involved estimating your speed and direction over time to calculate your position. This was an imprecise art, and errors could accumulate quickly, but experienced sailors got pretty good at it. Pirates also used the sun and stars for navigation. At noon, the sun would be at its highest point, and by measuring its angle with a tool called a backstaff, or later a sextant, you could determine your latitude. Longitude was much harder to calculate and required an accurate clock, which didn't become common until the late 18th century, so pirates usually relied on dead reckoning and landmarks for east-west positioning. When approaching land, they'd use a lead line to measure the depth of the water and get a sense of the bottom composition, which could help identify a location. All of these methods required skill and experience, but they didn't require detailed maps. A pirate captain just needed to know the general direction to the nearest port or the next likely shipping lane, and they could figure out the rest as they went. Now let's talk about some of the specific goods that pirates targeted, because treasure wasn't just gold and silver. Sugar was one of the most valuable commodities in the Caribbean, and pirates would happily capture a ship loaded with sugar barrels because sugar could be sold easily in any port. Tobacco was another target, as were spices like pepper and cinnamon, which were worth their weight in gold in European markets. Pirates also stole textiles, cloth, silk, and fancy fabrics that could be sold or traded. Weapons and ammunition were always in demand, both for the pirates' own use and for resale. Medicine was incredibly valuable, as Blackbeard's ransom of Charleston demonstrated, because disease was rampant in the Caribbean, and a good surgeon with a stock of medicine could mean the difference between life and death. Pirates also stole slaves, which is one of the darkest aspects of piracy, and one that's often left out of romanticized accounts. Many pirates had no moral qualms about capturing and selling human beings, and the slave trade was deeply intertwined with piracy in the Caribbean and West Africa. Some pirates like Bartholomew Roberts made fortunes raiding slave ships, either stealing the enslaved people to sell themselves or holding them for ransom. This brutal reality is a reminder that piracy wasn't some swashbuckling adventure. It was a violent, exploitative business that caused immense suffering. Let's also talk about the myth of pirate codes and democracy, because while pirate ships were more egalitarian than naval vessels, they weren't exactly utopian communes. The Articles of Agreement on a pirate ship were practical documents that laid out rules to keep order and ensure everyone got a fair share. but they were also enforced with violence. Breaking the rules could result in flogging, marooning, or even execution. The idea that pirates voted on everything and respected each other's rights is a bit overstated. Yes, they elected their captains and could remove them, but once a captain was in charge, they had significant authority during battle and could make life or death decisions. The quartermaster, who was also elected, acted as a check on the captain's power and represented the interests of the crew, which created a balance of power. This system worked because it was in everyone's interest to maintain order and maximize profit. But it was still a harsh, violent world where disputes were often settled with a blade or a pistol. Now let's talk about some of the famous pirate havens and how they functioned as hubs for intelligence and trade. Port Royal, Jamaica was one of the most notorious pirate havens of the 17th century, a place where buccaneers and privateers could sell their loot, resupply, and spend their money. The town was famously depraved, filled with taverns, brothels, and gambling dens, and it was said that you could buy anything in Port Royal if you had the money. The city's location made it ideal for piracy. It was close to Spanish shipping lanes and had a natural harbor that could shelter dozens of ships. Port Royal's prosperity was built on piracy and the slave trade, and it was one of the wealthiest cities in the Caribbean until 1992, when a massive earthquake and tsunami destroyed most of the town and killed thousands. Many saw the disaster as divine judgment on a city of sin, and Port Royal never fully recovered its former glory. After its decline, Nassau in the Bahamas took over as the main pirate haven, as we mentioned earlier, until Woodes Rogers arrived and cleaned it up. These havens were crucial to pirate operations because they provided a place where pirates could gather, exchange information, and plan their next moves. Without these safe harbors, piracy would have been much harder to sustain.
Let's also consider the role of women in piracy, because while the vast majority of pirates were men, there were a few notable female pirates who operated during the Golden Age, and their stories challenged the stereotype of piracy as an exclusively male domain. Anne Bonny and Mary Read are the most famous female pirates, and both served on the ship of Calico Jack Rackham in the early 1700s. According to historical accounts, both women disguised themselves as men and proved to be fierce fighters, taking part in raids and battles alongside the male crew members. When Rackham's ship was captured by pirate hunters in 1720, Anne and Mary were among the few crew members who fought back while the men supposedly cowered below deck. Both women were sentenced to hang, but they pleaded their bellies, claimed they were pregnant, which delayed their executions. Mary Read died in prison, possibly from fever, while Anne Bonny's fate is unknown. Some accounts say she was released, others say she died in prison, and there are even legends that she returned to a normal life under a different name. The point is, women could and did participate in piracy, though they were rare, and they used the same methods as male pirates, intelligence, timing, and violence, to find and capture their targets. Now let's talk about the legacy of piracy, and how the myths of buried treasure have endured despite the lack of evidence. Part of the reason treasure maps became so popular in fiction is that they represent the ultimate fantasy, the idea that vast wealth is out there, hidden, waiting to be discovered by someone clever or lucky enough to find it. This fantasy has fueled countless treasure hunts, books, movies, and legends, from Treasure Island to the Pirates of the Caribbean films. The reality is that most pirate treasure was spent, lost, or recaptured long ago, and the chances of finding a buried chest full of gold are astronomically small. But that hasn't stopped people from trying. Oak Island in Nova Scotia has been the site of treasure hunting for over 2 centuries, based on legends that pirates or someone else buried treasure there in a complex system of booby-trapped tunnels. Despite millions of dollars spent and numerous excavations, no treasure has ever been found, and many skeptics believe there was never anything there to begin with. Yet the search continues because the myth of buried treasure is too compelling to let go. Let's also talk about the economic context of piracy, because understanding why piracy flourished helps explain how pirates operated. The late 17th and early 18th centuries were at a time of intense colonial competition and warfare in the Caribbean.
Spain, England, France, and the Dutch were all fighting for control of territory, trade, and resources, and they used privateers to weaken each other's economies. When wars ended, thousands of sailors and privateers were suddenly out of work, and many turned to piracy as a way to make a living. The colonial governments were weak and corrupt, and enforcement of laws was inconsistent, which created a power vacuum that pirates exploited. At the same time, the Caribbean was experiencing an economic boom driven by sugar, slavery, and trade, which meant there were plenty of rich targets for pirates to attack. The combination of opportunity, desperation, and weak governance created the perfect conditions for piracy to thrive. It wasn't until the major European powers decided to crack down, sending naval patrols, offering pardons, and hanging captured pirates, that piracy began to decline. The end of the golden age of piracy came not because pirates ran out of treasure to find, but because the risks outweighed the rewards and legitimate opportunities became available. Now let's talk about some of the tools and tactics pirates used in actual raids, because understanding how they captured ships reveals how they found their treasure. Pirates preferred speed and surprise. They'd use small, fast ships that could outmaneuver larger, slower merchant vessels. Sloops and schooners were popular pirate ships because they were agile, could sail in shallow water, and could be rowed if the wind died down. When pirates spotted a target, they'd approach quickly, often flying false flags to avoid suspicion, and then raise the Jolly Roger at the last moment to intimidate the crew into surrendering. If the target tried to run, the pirates would fire warning shots or aim for the rigging to disable the ship without sinking it. After all, they wanted to capture the cargo, not send it to the bottom of the ocean. If the target surrendered, the pirates would board, take control, and search the ship for valuables. They'd interrogate the crew and passengers, check the cargo holds, and even search personal belongings for hidden money or jewelry. If the target resisted, the pirates would fight, using cutlasses, pistols, and boarding axes in close-quarters combat. But most pirates preferred to avoid bloodshed if possible, because every man lost in battle was one less hand to work the ship and one less share of the loot. The key to a successful raid was preparation, knowing which ships to target, when to strike, and how to maximize profit with minimal risk. This required intelligence, not maps. Let's also address the question of whether any pirate treasure has actually been found in modern times. The answer is yes, but it's usually in the form of shipwrecks, not buried chests. The Whydah, as we mentioned, is the most famous example, a pirate ship that sank in 1717 and was discovered in 1984. The wreck has yielded a treasure trove of artifacts, including gold coins, jewelry, weapons, and personal items that have given historians incredible insights into pirate life. Another significant find was the wreck of the Queen Anne's Revan, Blackbeard's flagship, which ran aground off the coast of North Carolina in 1718 and was discovered in 1996. Divers have recovered cannons, anchors, medical instruments, and other artifacts, though no massive hoard of gold has been found. These discoveries confirm what historians have long suspected. Pirate treasure, when it exists, is usually the result of shipwrecks or lost cargo, not deliberate hiding. The ocean floor of the Caribbean is littered with the remains of hundreds of ships, both pirate and merchant, that went down in storms or battles, and some of them may still hold valuable cargo. But finding these wrecks requires advanced technology, significant funding, and a lot of luck. It's a far cry from following a map with an X on it. Now let's talk about the role of luck and chance in piracy, because while pirates used intelligence and planning to find their targets, there was always an element of randomness involved. The ocean is a vast, unpredictable place, and even the best-laid plans could be undone by a sudden storm, a change in wind, or a ship taking an unexpected route. Pirates had to be opportunistic and flexible, ready to seize any chance they came across. Sometimes they'd spend weeks cruising without seeing a single target, and other times they'd stumble across a treasure ship by pure accident. This element of luck is part of what made piracy so appealing and so dangerous. You never knew what was going to happen next, and fortunes could change in an instant. A pirate crew might capture a rich prize one day and be starving and broke the next, depending on the whims of fate and the sea.
This unpredictability also meant that pirates couldn't rely on long-term planning or treasure maps. They had to live in the moment, take what they could get, and hope they'd be lucky enough to survive another day.
Let's talk about the relationship between pirates and the indigenous peoples of the Caribbean, because this is another aspect of pirate operations that often gets overlooked. Many Caribbean islands were inhabited by indigenous groups like the Taino, Carib, and Arawak peoples, though their populations had been devastated by disease and Spanish colonization by the time the golden age of piracy rolled around. Pirates sometimes formed alliances with indigenous communities or with escaped slaves called Maroons who lived in remote areas. These groups could provide pirates with local knowledge, safe anchorages, sources of fresh water, and information about Spanish movements. In exchange, pirates might trade weapons, tools, or other goods. Some pirates even took indigenous wives or partners, creating mixed communities in remote islands and coastal areas. This kind of local cooperation was far more valuable than any treasure map because it gave pirates access to resources and intelligence that helped them survive and operate effectively. The Caribbean was a complex, multicultural world where different groups interacted, traded, fought, and formed alliances based on mutual interest, and pirates were very much part of that mix. They weren't isolated outlaws. They were embedded in the social and economic networks of the region, which is how they were able to operate so successfully for so long. Now let's consider the psychological and social aspects of piracy, because understanding why men became pirates helps explain their approach to treasure. Most pirates came from the lowest rungs of society. They were poor sailors, former indentured servants, escaped slaves, or desperate men who saw piracy as their only chance at a better life. Life in the merchant marine or navy was brutal. Sailors were poorly paid, badly fed, harshly disciplined, and often cheated out of their wages by corrupt officers. Piracy offered an alternative, where men had a say in how the ship was run, where the loot was divided more fairly, and where you had a chance, however slim, of making a fortune. But it also meant living with constant danger, knowing that capture meant a public hanging and that your former shipmates might betray you for a reward. This created a culture where trust was limited, betrayal was common, and the future was uncertain. In that context, burying treasure made no sense. You took your share, you spent it while you could, and you hoped to live long enough to do it again. The pirate life was short, violent, and often ended badly, but for men who had no other options, it was worth the risk. This desperate, live-for-today mentality is the real reason treasure maps are a myth. Pirates didn't have the luxury of planning for a future that might never come. So they spent it all, burned through their earnings, and then went back to sea to find more. It was a vicious cycle, but it was also the only way they knew how to live. Now let's talk about the role of alcohol in pirate culture, because it's relevant to how pirates handled money and treasure. Rum was the drink of choice in the Caribbean, cheap, plentiful, and strong, and pirates consumed vast quantities of it. Drinking was a way to pass the time, bond with your crew, and forget about the dangers and hardships of pirate life. But it also meant that pirates were often drunk, which didn't exactly encourage responsible financial planning. A pirate who just received his share of the loot was likely to head straight to the nearest tavern and drink until the money ran out, which might be a matter of days or even hours. Stories abound of pirates who made fortunes and squandered them just as quickly on booze, gambling, and women. This wasn't a culture that valued thrift or long-term thinking. It was a culture of excess and immediacy, where the goal was to enjoy yourself while you still could. The idea of carefully hiding your treasure for later would have seemed absurd to most pirates, who knew from experience that tomorrow might never come. So they spent it all, burned through their earnings, and then went back to sea to find more. It was a vicious cycle, but it was also the only way they knew how to live. Now let's talk about some of the specific techniques pirates used to extract information from captured crews, because this was one of their primary methods of finding treasure and valuable targets. When pirates captured a ship, they didn't just take the cargo and leave. They interrogated everyone on board to find out what else was out there worth stealing. They'd ask about other ships the crew had seen, what ports they'd visited, what goods were being traded, and whether any rich passengers or valuable shipments were in the area.
Pirates could be brutal in these interrogations. There are accounts of them torturing prisoners to make them talk, though how common this actually was is debated by historians. Some pirates, like Blackbeard, were known for theatrical cruelty that was designed to terrify victims into cooperation without actually having to hurt them much. Others, like Charles Vane or Edward Lowe, had reputations for genuine sadism and violence. The threat of torture was often enough to make people talk, especially merchant sailors who had no personal stake in protecting their cargo. Once pirates had gathered intelligence from a captured crew, they'd use that information to plan their next move, maybe heading to a certain port where they knew a rich ship was expected, or changing course to intercept a convoy they'd heard about. This kind of real-time intelligence gathering was far more effective than any map because it gave pirates current, actionable information about where the money was and how to get it.
Let's also consider the role of pirate quartermasters, because this position was crucial to how treasure was managed and distributed. The quartermaster was elected by the crew, just like the captain, and his job was to represent the interests of the common sailors and ensure fair treatment. During battles, the captain was in charge, but at all other times, the quartermaster had significant authority. He was responsible for dividing the loot according to the ship's articles, settling disputes among the crew, and managing supplies and provisions. A good quartermaster kept detailed accounts of what was captured and made sure everyone got their fair share. This system worked because it was transparent and democratic. Everyone could see that the division was fair, which reduced the potential for conflict and mutiny. The quartermaster was also responsible for punishing crew members who broke the rules, which might involve flogging, marooning, or even execution in extreme cases. This balance of power between captain and quartermaster is one of the most interesting aspects of pirate governance, and it's a reminder that pirate ships weren't just chaotic mobs. They had structure, rules, and accountability, at least by their own standards. The fact that treasure was divided up immediately and overseen by an elected official meant there was no opportunity or need to hide it for later. Everyone took their share and went their separate ways until the next raid. Now let's talk about the environmental challenges pirates faced and how these affected their operations. The Caribbean is beautiful, but it's also dangerous. Hurricanes, tropical storms, coral reefs, and unpredictable currents made navigation treacherous, especially in an era before accurate weather forecasting or reliable charts. Pirates had to be skilled sailors just to survive, let alone find treasure. They learned to read the weather by watching the sky and sea, looking for signs of approaching storms, and they knew which months were hurricane season and adjusted their activities accordingly. They also had to deal with tropical diseases like yellow fever, malaria, and dysentery, which killed more sailors than combat ever did. A pirate ship was a breeding ground for disease. Cramped, unsanitary conditions, poor diet, contaminated water, and swarms of mosquitoes meant that illness was a constant companion. Pirates who survived long enough to capture treasure often died of fever before they could spend it, which is another reason why they lived fast and spent freely. There was no guarantee they'd be alive next week. The harsh environment of the Caribbean shaped pirate culture and tactics in profound ways, reinforcing the live-for-today mentality and making long-term planning seem pointless. You can't bury treasure if you're dead from yellow fever, and you can't dig it up again if your ship has been wrecked in a hurricane, so why bother trying? Let's also talk about the economic impact of piracy on colonial trade and how this relates to treasure. Piracy was a huge problem for European powers because it disrupted trade, drove up insurance costs, and threatened the flow of wealth from the colonies back to Europe. Merchants and investors lobbied their governments to do something about the pirate menace, which eventually led to the crackdown that ended the golden age of piracy. But in the meantime, the economic disruption caused by pirates was significant. Ships would travel in convoys for protection, which was slower and more expensive than sailing independently. Insurance rates for cargo and ships skyrocketed, making trade less profitable. Some colonial governors were so worried about piracy that they negotiated with pirates or even hired former pirates to defend against other pirates, which created a bizarre situation where the line between law enforcement and criminality became very blurred. This economic context helps explain why pirates focused on intercepting trade rather than burying treasure. The real money was in the constant flow of goods between the colonies and Europe, and pirates positioned themselves to skim off a portion of that flow. They were parasites on the colonial economy, taking what they could while it lasted, and when the hosts finally got serious about eliminating them, the party was over. Now let's talk about some of the lesser-known pirates and their methods, because the famous names like Blackbeard and Henry Morgan tend to overshadow the dozens of other successful pirates who operated during the Golden Age. Take Stede Bonnet, for example, a wealthy Barbadian plantation owner who inexplicably decided to become a pirate in 1717 despite having no sailing experience and no apparent need for money. Bonnet bought his own ship, which was unusual as most pirates stole theirs, and hired a crew, then proceeded to be terrible at piracy. He was eventually captured and hanged, but not before sailing with Blackbeard for a while and learning some of the trade. Bonnet's story is interesting because it shows that not all pirates fit the stereotype of the desperate, impoverished sailor. Some, like Bonnet, came from privilege and chose piracy for reasons that remain mysterious. Maybe it was a midlife crisis, maybe it was mental illness, maybe he just hated his wife, as some contemporaries suggested. Whatever the reason, Bonnet's approach to finding treasure was the same as everyone else's: intelligence, timing, violence, and a good understanding of where the Spanish treasure ships were sailing. No maps required, just guts and knowledge.
Let's also talk about the role of pirate chroniclers and how much of what we know about piracy comes from a single source. A book called A General History of the Pirates, published in 1724 and attributed to a Captain Charles Johnson, though the real author is unknown and might have been Daniel Defoe. This book contains detailed accounts of famous pirates like Blackbeard, Calico Jack, Anne Bonny, and many others, and it's the source of much of the popular mythology around piracy. The problem is, we don't know how accurate it is. Some of the stories are clearly embellished or invented for dramatic effect, while others seem to be based on real events and court records. The book was immensely popular and went through multiple editions, shaping public perception of pirates for centuries. It's possible that some of the myths about buried treasure in treasure maps originated or were popularized by this book and similar works of fiction disguised as history. The line between fact and fiction in pirate history is often blurry, and modern historians have to be careful about separating reliable evidence from entertaining stories. What we can say with confidence is that the real pirates, as opposed to the fictional ones, were practical criminals who focused on intercepting valuable cargo in transit, not on burying treasure for later. Now let's talk about the fate of captured pirates and how this relates to treasure. When pirates were caught by naval patrols or pirate hunters, they were usually taken back to a colonial port and put on trial. These trials were often quick and harsh. Piracy was a capital crime, and the penalty was death by hanging. The trials served a dual purpose: punishing the criminals and deterring others from taking up piracy. Pirates would be interrogated about their crimes, their shipmates, and crucially, what they'd done with the loot. Authorities were very interested in recovering stolen goods and treasure, and they would question captured pirates extensively about where the treasure was. If there had been a widespread practice of burying treasure, these interrogations would have revealed it, and we'd have records of treasure being recovered or maps being confiscated. But the historical record shows the opposite. Again and again, when pirates were captured, the treasure had already been spent or divided up, and there was nothing left to recover. This is strong evidence that buried treasure was not a common practice. Pirates knew they'd be interrogated if caught, which was another reason not to hide treasure. It would just give the authorities something to torture you over. Better to have it spent at all and have nothing to confess. Let's also consider the role of pirate ships themselves as a form of mobile treasure. A well-armed, fast ship was worth more than gold to a pirate crew because it was the tool that allowed them to capture treasure in the first place. Pirates took great care of their ships, careening them regularly, repairing damage, and making modifications to improve speed and firepower. Losing your ship meant losing everything,
so pirates would fight desperately to defend their vessels. When Blackbeard's ship, the Queen Anne's Revenge, ran aground in 1718, it was a disaster for his crew. They lost their most powerful vessel and had to scatter to smaller ships. Blackbeard himself was killed a few months later, partly because he no longer had the Queen Anne's Revenge to intimidate his enemies. The point is, the ship itself was the treasure, or at least the means to treasure, and pirates invested heavily in maintaining and upgrading their vessels. This is another reason why burying treasure made no sense. The money was better spent on the ship, which could generate more income through future raids. Now let's talk about the myth of deserted islands and how this relates to treasure. In fiction, pirates are always burying treasure on remote, uninhabited islands where no one will find it. But the reality is that there weren't many truly deserted islands in the Caribbean. Most islands were either inhabited, controlled by colonial powers, or regularly visited by sailors, fishermen, and traders. The Caribbean was a busy, crowded place, not a wilderness of empty tropical islands. Even islands that seemed deserted might have indigenous inhabitants, escaped slaves, or other pirates lurking around. Finding a place secure enough to bury treasure without someone else discovering it would have been difficult. And even if you did find such a place, you'd have to remember where it was and be able to find it again, which wasn't easy in an era before GPS or accurate maps. The idea of a secret island known only to one pirate crew is mostly fantasy. In reality, pirates operated in a well-traveled maritime world where information spread quickly and secrets were hard to keep. If you buried treasure, someone else would probably find it before you got back, so why take the risk? Let's talk about the decline of Spanish power and how this affected piracy. Spain had dominated the Caribbean and Latin America for nearly 2 centuries, but by the early 1700s, Spanish power was waning. Other European nations, England, France, and the Dutch, had established colonies and were challenging Spanish control of trade. This shift in the balance of power created opportunities for pirates, because Spanish ships were no longer as well protected as they once were, and the Spanish Navy was stretched thin trying to defend a vast empire. Pirates took advantage of Spanish weakness to raid treasure fleets and coastal settlements, knowing that the Spanish were less able to retaliate than they had been in the past. But this also meant that as Spanish power declined, so did the flow of treasure from the Americas, because the Spanish were extracting less silver and gold from their colonies. By the time the golden age of piracy ended in the 1720s, the easy pickings were gone. The Spanish treasure fleets were better guarded, colonial navies were more aggressive, and the Caribbean was generally less chaotic and more controlled. Pirates who had relied on Spanish treasure as their primary target had to adapt or go out of business, and many chose the latter, either by accepting pardons or getting hanged.
Now let's talk about the role of privateering after the age of piracy ended, because piracy didn't completely disappear, it just went underground and became less organized. Throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, there were still pirates operating in the Caribbean, Mediterranean, and other waters, but they were smaller scale and less successful than the great pirate crews of the Golden Age. Privateering continued as well, especially during the American Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars, when governments issued letters of marque to private ships to attack enemy commerce. Some of these privateers were barely distinguishable from pirates. Jean Lafitte, for example, operated out of Louisiana in the early 1800s and was both a privateer and a smuggler, and possibly a pirate, depending on who you asked. Lafitte famously helped defend New Orleans against the British in 1815, which earned him a pardon and a place in American folklore. But even Lafitte, operating a century after the Golden Age, didn't bury treasure. He ran a smuggling operation, dealt in stolen goods, and lived openly in New Orleans when the law allowed it. The treasure-hunting, map-following pirate was still a myth, even in an era when piracy had been romanticized and sanitized in popular culture. Let's also talk about the archaeology of piracy and what physical evidence tells us about how pirates lived and operated. Shipwrecks like the Witta and Queen Anne's Revenge have provided archaeologists with thousands of artifacts, weapons, tools, coins, jewelry, navigational instruments, and personal items. These finds confirm that pirates used standard maritime equipment and didn't have any special treasure-finding tools. The coins found on pirate wrecks are from all over the world: Spanish pieces of 8, English guineas, French livres,
Portuguese cruzados, which shows that pirates operated in a global economy and took whatever currency they could get. The lack of treasure maps or any similar documents in these wrecks is telling. If pirates had routinely used maps to hide treasure, we'd expect to find some evidence of this practice, even if the maps themselves had disintegrated. But there's nothing. No marked charts, no encoded documents, no signs that pirates were engaged in elaborate treasure-hiding schemes. The archaeological evidence supports the historical record. Pirates were practical criminals who took valuable goods and spent or traded them as quickly as possible. Now let's talk about modern treasure hunting and why people are still looking for pirate treasure despite all the evidence that it doesn't exist. Part of the appeal is psychological. Humans love the idea of hidden wealth and the possibility of striking it rich with a lucky find. Metal detectors, underwater robots, and satellite imaging have made treasure hunting more feasible than ever, but they've also revealed how rare genuine finds are. For every success story like the Witta, there are thousands of failed searches and exhausted resources. Some treasure hunters are motivated by genuine historical interest, wanting to recover artifacts and learn more about the past, while others are just in it for the potential payday. There's a whole industry built around treasure hunting: books, TV shows, tours, and equipment sales that keeps the myth of buried pirate treasure alive, even though the actual chances of finding anything are incredibly slim. Shows like The Curse of Oak Island have run for years based on the premise that treasure might be buried somewhere, despite finding essentially nothing of value. The myth persists because people want to believe in it, and because the entertainment value of the search is often more important than the actual outcome. Let's also talk about how different pirate cultures had different approaches to treasure and wealth. Caribbean pirates of the Golden Age were mostly European: English, French, Irish, Scottish, and Welsh, and they brought with them the economic attitudes of their home countries, where wealth was something to be accumulated, saved, and passed down. But the reality of pirate life quickly eroded those attitudes. Pirates who came from poverty had no experience with saving money or planning for the future, and even pirates from better backgrounds found that the uncertainty and danger of their profession made long-term planning pointless. In contrast, the Barbary pirates of North Africa, who operated from bases in Algiers, Tunis, and Tripoli, had a different economic system. They were often state-sponsored corsairs who captured ships and enslaved their crews, selling them in North African slave markets. These corsairs operated within a more stable political and economic framework, and some of them accumulated significant wealth and property over time. But even the Barbary pirates didn't bury treasure. They invested in houses, businesses, and slaves because they had a more secure base of operations and a longer time horizon. The instability and chaos of Caribbean piracy meant that treasure was always temporary, something to be enjoyed now rather than saved for later. Now let's talk about the role of religion and superstition in pirate culture, because these beliefs influenced how pirates thought about wealth and fortune. Many pirates were superstitious, believing in omens, curses, and lucky charms. A ship that had been successful in raids might be considered lucky, while one that had suffered losses might be thought cursed. Some pirates wore amulets or carried talismans for protection, and there are accounts of pirates consulting fortune tellers or practicing folk magic. These superstitions sometimes extended to treasure. There were stories of cursed gold or haunted islands where terrible things happened to anyone who took the treasure. Whether pirates actually believed these stories or just enjoyed telling them around the fire is debatable, but the prevalence of supernatural themes in pirate lore suggests that pirates, like most people of their era, had a worldview that included elements of magic and fate. This might have made some pirates reluctant to bury treasure, fearing that disturbing the earth or hiding wealth might bring bad luck. But more likely, the superstitions were just another form of entertainment in a harsh, boring life, and they didn't significantly affect how pirates handled their loot. Let's talk about the economics of treasure hunting in modern times and why it's usually not profitable. Searching for sunken treasure requires expensive equipment, boats, sonar, diving gear, underwater robots, and a lot of time. Most searches turn up nothing, and even when something is found, there are legal complications. Governments may claim ownership of wrecks in their territorial waters, and even wrecks in international waters are subject to complex maritime law. The salvage rights, archaeological significance, and cultural heritage issues can tie up a find in courts for years. Some treasure hunters have made money, like Mel Fisher, who found the Spanish galleon Nuestra Señora de Atocha in 1985 and recovered over $400 million worth of gold, silver, and jewels. But Fisher spent 16 years searching and lost his son and daughter-in-law in a diving accident during the hunt. For every Mel Fisher, there are hundreds of treasure hunters who go broke chasing dreams. The economics simply don't work out most of the time, which is why professional archaeologists often criticize treasure hunters for destroying historical sites in pursuit of profit. The responsible approach is to treat shipwrecks as archaeological sites and carefully excavate and document everything. But that's slow, expensive, and doesn't always yield dramatic finds. So treasure hunters often take shortcuts that damage the historical record.
Now, let's talk about pirate museums and historical sites, because these places help preserve and present the real history of piracy, as opposed to the Hollywood myths. The Pirate Soul Museum in Key West, the Pirates of Nassau Museum in the Bahamas, and the Whitehall Pirate Museum in Massachusetts all display authentic artifacts and tell the stories of real pirates based on historical research. These museums have helped educate the public about what piracy was actually like, moving beyond the stereotypes and showing the complex reality of life at sea in the early 18th century. They also display genuine treasure from shipwrecks, coins, jewelry, weapons, and everyday items that give us a glimpse into pirate life. Seeing these artifacts in person brings home the fact that pirates were real people who lived, fought, and died in pursuit of wealth that was almost always fleeting. The museums don't perpetuate the treasure map myth. Instead, they present piracy as a historical phenomenon rooted in specific economic and political conditions, and they show how pirates actually operated. This kind of education is valuable because it replaces romantic fantasy with historical understanding, and it helps people appreciate the real challenges and complexities of maritime life in the Age of Sail. Let's also talk about the literary and cultural legacy of piracy, because the myths we've been discussing didn't appear out of nowhere. They were created and spread through books, plays, movies, and other forms of entertainment. Treasure Island, published in 1883, crystallized many pirate tropes that are still with us today. The treasure map, the deserted island, the one-legged pirate with a parrot, the mutiny, the buried chest of gold. Robert Louis Stevenson created a template that countless authors and filmmakers have followed, from the 1950s Disney film Treasure Island to the Pirates of the Caribbean franchise. These works have done more to shape public perception of pirates than any historical research, which is why most people think of treasure maps when they think of pirates, even though treasure maps are almost entirely fictional. The persistence of these myths shows how powerful storytelling is. A good story can override facts and create a shared cultural understanding that has little to do with reality. The challenge for historians and educators is to compete with these compelling myths and present a version of piracy that's both accurate and interesting, which isn't always easy, because the truth is often messier and less dramatic than fiction. Now, let's talk about the psychology of treasure hunting and why the idea of finding buried treasure is so appealing. Psychologists who study motivation and reward systems have found that the possibility of a big payoff, even if the odds are terrible, can be incredibly motivating. This is the same principle that drives gambling, lottery playing, and speculative investing. The dream of hitting it big overcomes rational calculation of the odds. Treasure hunting combines this psychological appeal with adventure, mystery, and the romance of history, which makes it especially seductive. People who search for pirate treasure aren't just looking for money. They're looking for a connection to a legendary past, a chance to be part of a great story, and the thrill of discovery. The fact that the treasure probably doesn't exist doesn't diminish the appeal. In some ways, it enhances it, because the search becomes about the journey rather than the destination. This is why people keep looking for treasure on Oak Island, in the Caribbean, and anywhere else pirates might have operated, despite overwhelming evidence that there's nothing to find. The search itself is the point, and the myth of buried treasure is more valuable than any actual treasure could be, because it inspires imagination, adventure, and hope. Let's talk about how modern technology has changed treasure hunting and what it tells us about pirate treasure. Satellite imaging, ground-penetrating radar, magnetometers, and sophisticated sonar systems have made it possible to search areas that would have been impossible to explore a few decades ago. Underwater drones can dive deeper and stay down longer than human divers, and computer analysis can process vast amounts of data to identify likely wreck sites. Despite all this technology, genuine pirate treasure finds remain extremely rare, which strongly suggests that there simply isn't much treasure out there to find. If pirates had routinely buried treasure on land, metal detectors and ground-penetrating radar would have found it by now, given how many people have looked and how thoroughly they've searched. The fact that these searches keep coming up empty is powerful evidence that the treasure map myth is just that, a myth. The real treasure is underwater, in the form of shipwrecks, and even those are rare and difficult to find because the ocean is vast and wrecks are often buried under sand or coral. Technology has made treasure hunting more systematic and scientific, but it has also revealed the limits of what's actually out there, which is far less than the myths would suggest. Now, let's talk about the ethical issues around treasure hunting and why many historians and archaeologists oppose it. When treasure hunters find a shipwreck and start pulling up artifacts, they're often destroying a historical site that can never be reconstructed. Archaeologists work slowly and carefully, documenting the position of every artifact and analyzing the context, because the relationships between objects tell us as much as the objects themselves. Treasure hunters, on the other hand, are usually focused on finding valuable items, gold, silver, jewelry, and they may disturb or discard less valuable artifacts that have historical significance. This has led to conflicts between treasure hunters and archaeologists, with the latter arguing that shipwrecks should be protected as underwater museums and cultural heritage sites, while treasure hunters argue that they're salvaging history that would otherwise be lost. The legal situation is complex and varies by country and location, but there is a growing international consensus that underwater cultural heritage should be preserved rather than exploited for profit. This debate is relevant to pirate treasure because it affects how we approach pirate shipwrecks and what happens to artifacts when they're recovered. Should they be sold to private collectors, or should they be preserved in museums where everyone can study and enjoy them? There's no easy answer, but the trend is toward greater protection and preservation, which means that future finds are more likely to end up in museums than in private collections.
Let's also talk about the role of piracy in modern times, because piracy didn't end in the 1720s. It just changed form. Today, piracy is most prevalent in areas like the waters off Somalia, the Strait of Malacca, and parts of West Africa, where modern pirates use speedboats, automatic weapons, and GPS to attack cargo ships, oil tankers, and fishing vessels. These modern pirates are motivated by poverty, political instability, and the opportunity to make quick money through ransom or theft. They don't bury treasure or use maps. They follow shipping lanes, track vessels with technology, and strike when security is weak. In many ways, modern piracy resembles historical piracy more than the Hollywood version does. It's opportunistic, violent, and focused on immediate profit. The international community has responded with naval patrols, armed security on ships, and prosecutions. But piracy remains a problem in regions where governance is weak and economic opportunities are limited. This modern piracy reminds us that the underlying conditions that created historical piracy, poverty, opportunity, weak law enforcement, still exist in some parts of the world, and that piracy is fundamentally an economic crime, driven by the desire for wealth in a world of inequality. Now, as we start to wind down this long, gentle journey through pirate history, let's reflect on what we've learned about how pirates actually found treasure without maps. The answer, it turns out, is surprisingly simple. They didn't find treasure in the sense of discovering hidden hoards. They intercepted it while it was in transit, using intelligence, local knowledge, timing, and violence.
They knew the trade routes, they gathered information from informants and captured sailors, they positioned themselves at choke points and near busy ports, and they waited for opportunities to strike. When they captured a valuable ship, they divided the loot immediately according to the ship's articles, and spent it as quickly as possible, because they lived in a world of constant danger and uncertainty, where tomorrow was never guaranteed. The myth of buried treasure and treasure maps is almost entirely fiction, created by novels and movies, and perpetuated by our collective desire for adventure and mystery. The real pirates were practical criminals who understood their business and operated efficiently within the economic and political constraints of their time. They didn't need maps because they had something better: knowledge, experience, and a network of contacts that told them where the money was and how to get it. The legacy of piracy is complex and contradictory. We romanticize pirates as freedom-loving rebels, but the reality was often brutal, exploitative, and short-lived. Pirates disrupted trade, terrorized innocent people, and sometimes engaged in practices like slavery that we now recognize as profoundly evil. But they also challenged authority, created surprisingly democratic social structures, and lived by codes that emphasized fairness and mutual aid, at least among themselves. The truth about pirates is more interesting and complicated than the myths, and understanding how they really operated, without treasure maps, without buried chests, just with savvy and ruthlessness, gives us a clearer picture of this fascinating period in maritime history. So the next time you see a movie or read a book about pirates following a treasure map to a deserted island, you can smile and appreciate the story for what it is: a compelling fantasy that has very little to do with how piracy actually worked, but that speaks to something deep in the human imagination, our eternal hope that somewhere out there, hidden treasure is waiting to be found. And that's something worth remembering when you next let your mind drift to thoughts of adventure on the high seas, even as you're drifting off to sleep, knowing that the real treasure of history is not what's buried beneath the sand, but what's preserved in the records and artifacts that tell us who we were and how we lived hundreds of years ago in a very different world.